I never wanted to step foot inside that house. None of us did. It stood at the end of the street, just past the old post office, where the road seemed to darken even in broad daylight. The windows were always covered, the yard overgrown with weeds that curled like skeletal fingers around the rusting fence. Everyone in town whispered about it, about the woman who lived inside. We called her the Phantom. She wasn't a ghost, not exactly. We saw her sometimes, just a glimpse, a silhouette against the curtains, a shadow moving behind the warped glass. She never left the house, never spoke to anyone. But there were nights when a strange, low chanting drifted through the cracks in the wood, a sound that made your blood turn to ice. And then people started disappearing. First, it was the stray dogs, the ones that used to roam the neighborhood, begging for scraps outside the diner. Then it was Mrs. Ellison's cat, found torn open behind the church, its insides scooped out like something had been feeding on it. Then it was a girl from town, Margaret Klein, 16 years old, walked home from the soda shop one evening and never made it. Her mother swore she saw Margaret just yards from their front door before she vanished into thin air. People started talking about the Hex House. No one had seen the woman in weeks. The house had gone silent, but the uneasy feeling never left, like a sickness spreading through the air. When the police finally knocked on the door, there was no answer. They almost left. But then, a sound, a whimper from inside. The officers kicked the door open, and the second it swung wide, something hit them, a stench so overpowering they staggered back, gagging. And then they saw it. The floor was covered in flies, swarms of them, thick as oil, swirling in the dim light. The furniture was overturned. The walls were smeared with something dark and dried. At first, they thought it was dirt, but it wasn't. It was blood. Then the basement door creaked open. The officers drew their guns, their boots crunching over something brittle and sharp as they stepped forward. The stairs groaned under their weight, the air growing colder with each step. They reached the bottom, and that's when they saw them. Two women, huddled together in the corner, thin as corpses, their eyes wide and unblinking. Their clothes were in tatters, their fingers raw and bloodied. One of them was shaking violently, whispering something over and over under her breath. The other just stared, not at the officers, not at the ceiling, but past them, up the stairs, toward the darkness beyond the door. And then, a voice, not from the women, not from the officers, but from the shadows above, soft, calm, amused. "You shouldn't have come here." And then the door slammed shut. The Phantom of the Hex House Part 2. The basement light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows along the damp stone walls. The officers froze, their breath shallow, fingers tightening around their weapons. The two women in the corner didn't move, didn't speak, except for the one still whispering, her lips forming silent, frantic prayers. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from above. One officer reached for his radio, but all that came through was static, a deep guttural crackling that rose in pitch until it was almost a scream. He ripped the device from his belt and smacked it, his hands trembling. "Who's up there?" his partner called out. Silence. The air shifted, thickening with an unnatural chill. The smell of rot clung to their throats, and beneath it, something worse. Something chemical. Then the whispering woman stopped. The sudden silence was more suffocating than the air itself. The other woman, the one who had been staring at the stairs, began to shake her head, her gaze still locked on the doorway. Her mouth opened, her lips cracked and dry, but the words came out hoarse, barely more than a breath. "She's just watching." A loud thud echoed from above. The officers spun around, guns raised. The sound had come from the hallway just outside the basement door. The wood groaned as something pressed against it, not forceful, not knocking, just leaning. The taller officer, the one closest to the door, took a slow step forward. His boots squished in something wet. He glanced down. Dark liquid oozed from the ceiling above, dripping onto his shoulder. He wiped at it with his free hand, squinting at the sticky, blackish smear across his fingers. Then the door burst open. The light bulb overhead exploded, plunging the basement into a swirling blackness. The women screamed. The officers staggered back, but something rushed past them, a cold gust of air, or maybe something else. The stairway groaned under a sudden weight, as if something heavy was crawling down. One of the officers fumbled for his flashlight, his breath ragged. The beam flickered before landing on the now open door. And there, at the top of the stairs, she stood, the phantom. But her face, it wasn't right. Her skin was stretched too tightly over her skull, her lips pulled back in an unnatural grinning rictus. Her eyes, wide and black, glistened like two empty pits. And then she moved, not stepped, glided like something being pulled by invisible strings, her body jerking unnaturally with each twitching motion. One of the women sobbed, curling in on herself. The other pressed her shaking fingers to her lips. "You shouldn't have come here," the phantom sang, her voice almost playful. Then she lurched forward. The flashlight died, and the screaming began. The screams echoed through the suffocating dark. A gunshot rang out, a flash of light, a deafening crack. But it did nothing. Nothing stopped her. Something cold brushed against the officer's face, and a sharp, bone-deep pain tore through his chest. He stumbled backward, choking on his own breath. His partner fumbled to reload, his hands slick with sweat, but it was too late. A guttural gasp rattled through the basement. Then the second officer felt it too, something behind him, a whisper against his ear. "Let me show you." The flashlight flickered back to life as it hit the ground. The beam spun wildly, casting erratic shadows across the basement walls. It landed on the first officer. His body was wrong. He was on the floor, his limbs twisted unnaturally, his mouth gaping in a silent scream. Blood seeped from his eyes, his ears, his nose, his veins dark and pulsing beneath his skin as if something moved inside them. Then, a hand on his ankle. The second officer kicked wildly, scrambling away, his pulse hammering in his skull. The two women hadn't moved from their corner, their expressions frozen in silent, open-mouthed terror. The phantom was nowhere to be seen, but her voice slithered through the air. "You want to know what I am, don't you?" The officer's breathing turned shallow. He gripped his gun, scanning the room with wild, darting eyes. A creak, a breath. Then he saw her, crawling out of the wall. Not from a doorway, not from the stairs, from the wall itself. Her limbs bent in ways they shouldn't, her fingers elongating, stretching like withered roots. Her face hung at an angle too sharp for a human neck, her lips twitching with some unspoken delight. "You're not supposed to see me," she giggled. The officer fired 3 times. The bullets passed through her. The phantom split apart, her body unraveling into strands of something dark and fibrous before pulling itself back together like a puppet on tangled strings. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut. Something heavy fell from the ceiling. A body. It was Margaret Klein, or what was left of her. She hung like a broken marionette, her body flayed open, her insides scooped hollow. Stitched together with black thread, a crude, gaping smile had been carved into her face, her eyes wide, locked in a state of endless, silent horror. The officer didn't even have time to scream. The phantom lunged, her arms stretching, her fingers digging into his skin. And then, darkness. The officer woke to the sound of dripping. His head throbbed. His body refused to move. He was cold, but something warm and sticky clung to his skin, soaking into his uniform. His fingers twitched against the rough stone floor, his breath shallow. And then, slowly, he opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was Margaret's body. She was still hanging above him, but now her head had turned, watching him. Her mouth, carved into that grotesque, stitched-up smile, seemed wider than before. The officer tried to push himself up, but something held him down. No, not something. Hands. Pale, withered hands. He sucked in a sharp breath, his body jerking in terror as he realized he was no longer alone. The two women, they were hovering over him, their skeletal faces twisted in unreadable expressions. Their fingers dug into his arms, his legs pressing him against the blood-soaked ground. Their nails were black, jagged, as if they had been clawing at something for years, but it was their eyes that made his stomach drop. They were empty, hollow, and then one of them spoke. "She's inside you now." The officer's blood ran cold. The other woman leaned closer, her breath rancid, her lips splitting as she smiled. "You let her in." He thrashed against their grip, his muscles screaming, but they were stronger than they looked. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, what was happening. But nothing made sense. Then the whispering started again, not from the women, not from above, but from inside his own head. He gasped, his back arching violently, his vision swimming. 1,000 voices poured into him, overlapping, merging, clawing at his thoughts. Some screamed, some laughed, some begged. And beneath it all, a familiar voice. "You shouldn't have come here." His own voice. The women released him all at once, and the officer collapsed, gasping for air. His body convulsed as a burning sensation spread through his veins. Something moving inside him, something trying to take hold. He forced himself up, his trembling hands pressing against the wall for support. The room tilted, the light pulsing in sickening waves. And then he saw her, the phantom. She stood in the corner, her body half submerged in the stone wall, her limbs twitching, her grin widening. But this time she had his face, his own eyes, his own smile, and she whispered, "It's time to go home." Then the world collapsed into darkness. The officer opened his eyes. He was standing outside the Hex House. The basement was gone. The darkness, the blood, the screams, gone. The house looked normal, old, abandoned, but not the rotting tomb he had just crawled out of. His hands were clean. His gun was gone. The sky overhead was a dull gray, the air silent. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? His heartbeat was slow, too slow. Something was wrong. He turned toward the street. The town looked as it always had, quiet, empty this early in the morning. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the pavement. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, to remember. And then he saw them. People, crowds of them, walking toward him, silent, staring. Their faces were wrong. Their eyes were black, their skin pale and stretched, their mouths frozen in twisted, unmoving grins. They were familiar, too familiar. The butcher from Main Street, the old man who ran the post office, the woman who sold flowers in the square, and in the very back, standing completely still, his own partner, dead, but grinning. The officer staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to run, but the moment he moved, the town moved with him. Their footsteps made no sound, their eyes never blinked. And then they spoke. Not in unison, not even in words. A whisper. 1,000 whispers crawling into his skull, pouring into his bones, speaking in his voice, his memories, his own thoughts. "You let her in. She's inside you now. You never left the house." He clutched his head, the words burrowing deeper, twisting, warping. His skin burned, his veins blackened. Then, a hand on his shoulder, cold, familiar. He turned. And there she was, the phantom. But she wasn't a woman anymore. She was him, his face, his body, his uniform, his own dead grinning reflection. And in that instant, he understood. There had never been an escape. There had never been an investigation. He had walked into that house, and he had never walked back out. Because now, he was the phantom, and the town belonged to him.